So the life of the Buddha is really attached to Buddhism itself, since the religion is so strongly based in personal experience. And in some ways, the understanding of the Buddhist teachings, also known as the Dharma, comes out of Siddhartha Gautama's lived experience. It's not something that comes out of a tradition that he received, but one that he was reforming. Now, it's really interesting that from the beginning, Siddhartha Gautama, later the Buddha, or the awakened one, fought the cult of personality and deflected attention of disciples from himself. He always emphasized his own humanity. He never talked about the importance of miracle stories. He felt like this was a distraction, that this was not a way to help with self-discovery at all. So in Indian tradition, the teachers, the gurus, often speak kind of solemnly, informally, and impersonally, and to give this sort of sense of serenity and self-control. But really what Buddha was looking for was a new way to be human, a new way to communicate truths and understandings in ways that were a little bit more flexible and dynamic. So if you look at the outline of his life, he lived in the 6th century into the 5th century BCE, so right in the middle of the Axial Age. And he grows up in northern India, born in Lumbini, raised in Kapilavatthu, which is in southern Nepal. And if you look at where this is in the upper area of the Ganges River Valley. And this is important because this is an area where there were a lot of towns, there was a lot of trade, there was a lot of change happening in this area during the Axial Age. We talked a little bit about that before, but essentially what you need to understand is that he was growing up in a time when people were starting to question the earlier traditions of the Vedic rituals and the earlier Hindu gods. So he's in that environment. Now, Lumbini, where Buddha was born, obviously is a place that people go to worship. But the palace that he grew up in, pictured on the left, was intentionally set up to distract him, because there was a prophecy when he was young that he would be a holy man, and that the only way to keep him from being a holy man would be to distract him from his destiny. So if you look at where we're the map here, you can see that all of the things that happened to Buddha happen in a fairly small area. His birthplace, his palace, where he starts teaching in Benares, all the way to Bodh Gaya, where he dies and is enlightened fully. Well, he dies to himself, and he ultimately dies in Bodh Gaya as well. So anyway, we're going to go through the story a little bit here. It begins with his mother, Maya, who has a dream of an elephant. Again, this is very much connecting to the Hindu traditions, because the Buddhists really don't emphasize supernatural things, but this is part of the story that gets told, in part because Hindus are trying to pull Buddha back into the Hindu tradition. And again, as you know, the elephant is a sign of Ganesh, a sign of Shiva, also bearing a lotus flower, so it has a Brahma component to it too. But she has a dream, and in this dream, this elephant comes to her, the lotus flower, and there's this sense of immaculate conception that she is being conceiving of Buddha sort of through this dream, as opposed to through her husband, Suddhodana, Siddhartha's dad. Anyway, that's going to be debated between Hindus and Buddhists, but that's part of the traditional story. So Buddha is born. He's not yet Buddha, so it's this is sort of looking at it after the fact. At this point, he's Siddhartha Gautama, and he is raised, presented to his father. His father, who is a king, wants him to follow in his footsteps. And basically, Siddhartha is the guy that has everything. He's got looks, he's got wealth, he's got social status, he's got attention being paid to him at all times. He trains as a warrior. He's extremely strong. He's good looking. He's got it all. Got everything. The money, the looks, the status, the fun. He's basically surrounded by beautiful women. Finally marries his cousin, a distant cousin, Yasodhara, they were both 16 at the time, and they fall deeply in love. And there are stories about Yasodhara and Siddhartha going around the palace and basically having sex up on the roof and falling down into the bushes and not paying any attention to people. I mean, they're just so completely infatuated. They've kind of lost themselves in this sort of the pleasure of love and the pleasure of sex and all of that. Now, about the same time that this happens, Siddhartha begins to explore. He begins to realize his life is a little bit constrained. Now, there are arguments as to whether this happens closer to when he's 16 or later in his 20s. But the most important thing is that Siddhartha has 4 visions, which sort of correspond to the 4 Noble Truths, if you think about it. He sneaks out of on his own, out of the palace. He sees 4 things. First of all, he sees a decrepit old man, a man who's dying of old age. And he realizes that he too will be an old man one day. He sees a man racked by disease lying in a bed. That's the one on the upper left. And he sees that he too will get sick one day. And then he finally sees a corpse, a dead body being brought for to be immolated, to be lit on fire, the way the Hindus deal with bodies. And he realizes that death is also his destiny. But probably the most important of the 4 visions is the final vision, which you see in the lower right, which is where he sees a monk. And when he sees the monk, he sees that that's his way out. So the problem, of course, is that he is now married. At this point, he also has a child whose name is Rahula. Rahula means fetter, F-E-T-T-E-R. A fetter is like a handcuff. And so that shows you what he thinks of his son, right? His son's getting in the way of what he needs to do. And so he doesn't want to stay with his wife, and he doesn't want to stay with his son because he realizes he has to go and find the truth. Now, this is a major violation of his dharma, to leave his family, to go off and find truth on his own. So a Hindu would find this to be absolutely repugnant. On a personal note, my dad, as I may have told you, was a meditation teacher and routinely abandoned me to go on meditation retreats. So I see the story a little bit through the eyes of Rahula, who may not have been so psyched that his dad kind of took off for his own spiritual enlightenment. So Siddhartha takes off his clothes of his king, and he puts on the ascetic robes. The orange robes are the clothes of a sannyasin, of a holy man. They're also the clothes of an inmate. Traditionally, the orange robes are worn by people who are of low caste status. So he's rejecting his caste, he's rejecting his dharma in life, and he's embracing a new approach. And he joins a group of samanas in the forest, and these men are all ascetics. And an ascetic is somebody who basically tries to deny all sense pleasures, even to the point of not eating and drinking for long periods of time. And so these ascetics basically sat in the woods for years at a time, doing very little other than simply denying themselves all kinds of experiences. And so this is where Siddhartha starts. And he is so hardcore about it that he almost kills himself. He gets down to about, a couple nuts and a couple leaves a day. And at one point he falls over into a river, almost drowns, and realizes, I can't do it this way. I have to change. So he goes on to a different path, and the different path is what's called the middle path. And the middle path, if there are 2 paths, one being the path of renunciation, to get rid of everything in your life, and the other one being the path of desire, which is to indulge in everything in your life, he wanted to go in the middle path. Don't indulge, but also don't renounce to the point where you really can't be able to live your life and pursue your inner life fully. So what's interesting about this is that he sits down in Bodh Gaya, which is where he had been practicing. And Bodh Gaya is a town with a large number of fig trees and bo trees. And he sits underneath a bo tree, which you can see here, and he basically says he will not rise up until he's enlightened. It is interesting that that night he is confronted by 2 visions. The first one is the goddess Kama. And if you remember from Hinduism, Kama is sexual love. He is first efforts are made to seduce him, right? To get him to come out of this state so that he can go back to a life of pleasure, indulge his sexuality, indulge his sense pleasures. And he does not do that, obviously. The second one is the god Mara, who's a kind of a demon. I look at these as kind of almost like psychological states. This is a god or a force that's challenging his right to enlightenment. Basically saying, you know, I'll do everything I can to distract you. It's the mind throwing, it's like the last gasp of the mind saying, I'm not going to allow you to do this. I'm not going to allow you to do this. And finally, his final gambit in this is when Mara says, look, even if you do become enlightened, no one will believe that you are. And you'll be so separate from everybody else. You'll be isolated, and it will be a terrible thing. So come back to the world, come back to the temptations, come back to all of the things that you've walked away from. So what does this lead us to? Finally, this leads us to a moment of enlightenment, which again, if you go to Bodh Gaya in India, there's still a shrine underneath one of the Bodhi trees there where ostensibly Siddhartha was first enlightened. And from there, of course, that's just the beginning. Siddhartha goes, he founds an order of monks called the Sangha. The Sangha is basically the teaching order. And you can see here he is as an older middle-aged man teaching younger men in the tradition of Buddhism. And through oral tradition, through his own experience, he's talking about the lived experience that he has. And the final part of the story is he returns home. And he returns home, and you can see Yasodhara, his wife, and Rahula, his son, waiting for him. And here he is in the front of a bunch of begging monks. And this is a tradition in Buddhism where the monks go begging with their bowls. I watched this when I was in Sri Lanka. It's really interesting. They go out and everybody gives them food. They eat what is given to them. But they really own nothing. And so he comes back. He accepts Yasodhara as one of his followers, one of his students. This is interesting because, of course, now we're seeing women who play an important role in Buddhism. If you remember, women weren't part of the caste system in India, but Siddhartha makes it clear that women are to be included and part of this new tradition, as are people from all different castes, which is a huge change. So basically for the next 40 years, Buddha goes, and the reason we call him Buddha is that Buddha is his enlightened name. The enlightened one goes, he teaches, he begs, he goes from place to place, wanders around, has more and more followers, and finally, at age 80, he dies. And his death, it's not clear whether it was intentional, but he ate some form of probably food-poisoned wild boar curry, or it might have been mushroom curry. But the important thing was he eats something that is in the process of killing him and is aware that he's going to die. So he takes to his bed and he lies down this way. And lots of times you see statues of the Buddha lying down, and this is the death of the Buddha. And of course, the Buddha's death isn't so important because in some ways he's already died to himself in his enlightenment. But it's sort of the final stage. It's like where the whole story culminates. So if you look at this, the death of the Buddha, the final step of his path happens here. And you can see this in the statues of reclining Buddha in Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka. I was there actually during a religious ceremony, incredibly up on that top area, right by those trees up there, watching. You have to imagine 10,000 people and candles, and it's an incredible thing to watch. I have not been to Japan, but you can see in the Japanese too, honoring the reclining Buddha. So, a few things about the Buddhist teachings. This idea of presence of mind, that wisdom and awareness come together, that you teach through a state of being, that the state of being is more important than the state of doing. He's not a man that spoke a whole lot. He, by all accounts, when he taught using very few words. The idea that, again, a cool head, a calm head, but a warm heart, loving, engaging, empathetic, but not overly intellectual. This idea of embracing the poor and the rejected is extremely important, and simplicity is very important. So of all these things, I want you to think about how all of them define what Buddhism is as a religion, and think about what the most important parts of his life are.